Здравствуйте, everyone, and welcome to episode 7 of History with a Drywaller. And today we are going to pick up where we left off last week in episode 6 with the first of probably 2, if not 3 episodes on everyone's favorite Soviet leader, Joseph Stalin. Now, of course, Joseph Stalin was not born with the name Joseph Stalin. He was born Yosef Jugashvili in 1878 in Georgia, and that is Georgia in the Caucasus in central Russia, not Georgia as in the southern United States. Now, I don't think Stalin's early life makes that big of a difference to us, so I'm going to summarize it very quickly. Essentially, he was an angry young man from an abusive household who ended up becoming a communist bank robber, sending all the proceeds from his bank robberies to the Bolsheviks and specifically to Vladimir Lenin. This would very much impress Lenin. Lenin, as we saw, really loves a good killer, and so Lenin would favor him and give him a lot of power and influence and allow Stalin to climb through the ranks of the party leadership. And this would lead to, as we saw last week, Stalin being a pretty big deal in the Soviet Union by the time of Lenin's death in 1924. So much of a big deal that he was actually able to screw Trotsky out of going to Lenin's funeral, as we saw last week. Now, the specific position that Stalin held was the General Secretary. And essentially what the General Secretary did was they were in charge of the hiring and firing in the Soviet administration. As you can imagine, this is a position that allows someone who may not have a whole lot of scruples or inhibitions to stack all significant party apparatuses with their loyal supporters and their cronies. And Stalin, being Stalin, this is exactly what he did. He stacked all kinds of administrations all over the Soviet Union with his cronies and his supporters, and in particular, this especially meant the leadership of the Cheka secret police. Stalin was a huge fan of secret police, as we are going to see again and again, and he made sure to have all the top guys in the Soviet secret police system be his buddies. But with that said, before we move on from talking about Stalin as the General Secretary, I would like to mention in brief, I don't believe I've mentioned this yet, that every leader of the Soviet Union has a different title, so to speak. Stalin was always known as the General Secretary. I believe either Khrushchev or Brezhnev was called the Premier. Lenin was... well, I don't remember what Lenin was, it doesn't really matter. But the point is that every single Soviet leader, as far as I'm aware, has a different job title because the Soviet constitution and Soviet structure is kind of garbage, and it basically didn't have a good system for any meaningful transfer of power. Essentially, Soviet transfers of power are just coups on top of coups on top of coups. So you're going to hear me mentioning a lot of party titles like General Secretary Stalin, but just know that it's all kind of nonsense. At this point, Stalin is essentially the number 1 or number 2 man in the Soviet Union, this point being at the time of Lenin's death in 1924. So just keep that in mind. So anyway, after Lenin died and was buried and became a museum piece, Stalin had a problem. Even with the suppression of Lenin's letter and screwing Trotsky out of Lenin's funeral, Trotsky was still potentially the second most powerful man in the Soviet Union and potentially even more powerful than Stalin. People really, really liked Trotsky. Trotsky was a war hero from the Russian Civil War. He was a famously gifted writer and speaker, and he had a ton of friends all throughout the Bolshevik Party. So in order for this ex-gangster and bank robber to have a chance, really, of opposing Trotsky, he would need some allies. And he found these allies in 2 of the other very powerful members of the upper echelons of the Soviet Union. And these 2 men were Grigory Zinoviev and Lev Kamenev. And with the help of these 2 cronies, they would essentially form an anti-Trotsky triple alliance. And they would sweep through the Soviet system and remove almost all of Trotsky's supporters from high positions and replace them with Stalinists. And this plan worked. Trotsky became a pursued man, essentially, in the corridors of power in the Soviet Union, and it became a very dangerous career move to associate with or support Trotsky, exactly how Stalin wanted it. Now, of course, as you've noticed, Zinoviev and Kamenev did the classic blunder in that they trusted Stalin. And in classic Stalin fashion, at the end of 1924, so just as a reminder, Lenin hasn't even been dead for a year, Stalin would do his favorite thing, and he would betray Kamenev and Zinoviev, sweeping all their supporters out of the ranks of the Bolshevik Party. Now, Kamenev and Zinoviev did not take this lying down, and they would essentially try to use Stalin's tactics against him, forming another alliance, this time with Trotsky against Stalin. But, as you can probably guess, by this time all three of them had lost way too much influence, as they're essentially operating in a country in which almost every member of every political organization is a personal supporter of Stalin. In responding to this triple alliance against him, Stalin would use another one of his signature moves, and that is using Lenin as a bludgeon to smash them. He essentially invoked Lenin's declaration against factionalism, which we talked about either last episode or the episode before, now I don't remember, in which Lenin had said that party members were not allowed to disagree with party leadership. And he used this rule to essentially accuse Kamenev, Zinoviev, and Trotsky of anti-Bolshevik conspiracy for daring to disagree with him. And this was a masterstroke. It destroyed any influence that the anti-Trotsky alliance had left. Kamenev and Zinoviev would publicly recant their opposition of Stalin and declare Stalin the true leader of the Soviet Union. And Trotsky would be removed from the party's central committee, and eventually in 1929 he would be deported from the country entirely. Almost all of Trotsky's supporters and Kamenev and Zinoviev's supporters would recant their views and also essentially swear allegiance to Stalin. But in spite of that, the vast majority of them would be killed in Stalin's purges in the following years. But before we move on from this, I would like to bring Trotsky's story to a close. Not necessarily because he has a ton of influence on the rest of Soviet history. He doesn't. He's essentially just used as a political boogeyman from here on out, in a very similar way to Goldstein in the Orwell novel 1984. But Trotsky has become such a recognizable name and face, frankly, in the history of not only Soviet communism, but of the entire worldwide communist movement, that I would like to bring his particular biography to a close. Now, in 1929, when Trotsky was deported from the Soviet Union, he would bounce all over European countries, fleeing from one country to the next, because at this point, the poor fella has a lot of enemies. Not only are there Soviet foreign agents that are following him around and trying to decide whether or not they're going to kill him, but there's also right-wing police units in all these countries who, as you can imagine, are not super excited at having the arch-Marxist coming to their doorstep. And there are even old Russian whites from the Civil War who are also not super happy at this guy who stole their country from them suddenly showing up in their new place of residence. To make matters even worse for poor Trotsky, he would be sentenced to death in absentia in 1936 in the Soviet Union. So now the Soviet Union has officially declared that they want him dead. And as a brief aside to this, this is also the year in which Kamenev and Zinoviev would be arrested, very likely tortured, and forced to confess to imaginary crimes and then executed. So yeah, it does not pay to be a friend of Stalin's. But at this point, Trotsky has escaped from Stalin's wrath. He would flee Europe entirely, now that the Soviets were really gunning for him, and he would arrive in Mexico in late 1936. In Mexico, he would actually find a nice little community of relatively friendly communists, including the famous Mexican artists Diego Rivera and Frida Kahlo. Unfortunately, no one escapes Stalin forever, and in August of 1940, Trotsky was attacked in his study by an NKVD agent. NKVD, by the way, is just the new Cheka secret police. The secret police also changes names about 1 billion times throughout Soviet history. But at any rate, Trotsky was attacked in his study by a Soviet agent with an ice axe, of all things, and the man attacked him when his back was turned and planted the ice axe in the back of Trotsky's head. But amazingly, at the age of 60, with a pretty severe wound from an ice axe in the back of his head, Trotsky would roar to life and fight off his attacker and actually broke the man's hand and captured him. Unfortunately, this turned out to be Trotsky's last hurrah, as he would succumb to his wounds and die later that night. And to briefly follow up with Kahlo and Rivera, both Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera would flee Mexico, as the NKVD agent who had killed Trotsky turned out to be a close friend of theirs, and they were wanted for pretty severe questioning from the Mexican authorities. Remember, kids, there are no good guys in the story of Soviet communism. But to jump back in time a little bit and get back to Stalin here, back in 1926, without Kamenev, Zinoviev, or Trotsky having any meaningful influence, Stalin was now the most powerful man in Russia, although he was not yet the unquestioned dictator that he would turn out to be. But that didn't stop him from going on to essentially change and adapt the very foundations of what is now called Marxism-Leninism in a series of public essays and declarations. Primarily, he would put forward a relatively new idea in communism, and that being that the revolution, instead of spreading all over the world and making one magical world government, he put forth the idea that communism would essentially result from the expansion and conquest of one nation, being something that was imposed on essentially conquered people, as opposed to something that was springing up from above, from the wellsprings of the proletariat. And this way more centralized and way more nationalistic attitude would define the rest of Soviet history. In fact, one of the big differences between later Soviet communism and Chinese communism is, at least in theory, Chinese communism is a lot more oriented toward that worldwide revolution, while Soviet communism was a lot more interested in essentially the Soviets conquering the world. And to this end of creating communism that would eventually conquer the world, in 1927, Stalin began the rapid cancellation of the new economic policies that had been put in place by Lenin to help with the giant famine. And following up with the example that had been put in place by Lenin, in early 1928, Stalin would denounce the kulaks. Again, as we mentioned last week, kulaks essentially just being wealthier, more successful peasants, and he would accuse these kulaks of hoarding grain. And this led to, as it always does, peasants having their grain confiscated, and any peasants who resisted would be arrested and deported to the gulags. This would, again, as it always seems to do, result in armed peasant uprisings exploding all over Russia. But by 1930, the now very well organized and very experienced Red Army had crushed all of these little rebellions. In this cancellation of the new economic policy, it's estimated, though again, at this time records are very hard to parse out, it's estimated that almost 2 million people were killed. So yeah, that's the kind of leader that Stalin is going to be. Also in 1928, the first of the very famous so-called 5-year plans was launched. Now, 5-year plans are essentially a consistent propaganda tool throughout actually the rest of Soviet history, in which the Soviet Union would set a goal and say, we have 5 years to complete this goal. And the goal was always something sort of arcane, as a certain amount of manufacturing, a certain amount of steel is going to be produced, and this many factories are going to be built, and all that sort of thing. And then they would always reach the 5-year goal, or at least say they reached it, and then it would be a big celebration, and then you'd set another 5-year. And so the first 5-year plan was in 1928, and they would, as I mentioned, sporadically continue until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991. Spoiler alert. Now, as for the first 5-year plan, this inaugural 5-year plan, if you will, this was an attempt to rapidly industrialize the mostly agrarian Soviet Union and collectivize agriculture. Because, as we've seen, if there's one thing that Marxists really, really like, it's collectivizing agriculture. But in a pattern that would also continue through the rest of the 5-year plans, the expectations that were set were wildly unrealistic. Even at the original 5-year 5-year plan mark. But of course, being the Soviets, they decided that they could complete the 5-year plan in 4 years, leading to the very famous slogan, the 5 and 4. And also, again, being the Soviets, any failure to meet these expectations would be met with very harsh punishments, which predictably meant that officials and record keepers and administrators on all levels lied and forged documents like crazy that were headed to Moscow. Because of this rampant corruption, it is actually really hard to tell what the results of the first 5-year plan were, but it does seem very likely, from what information we are able to gather, that the plan totally failed to meet any of its expectations. Industrialization did increase, and more of the Soviet agricultural system became collectivized and to some extent mechanized, but the reality fell far short of the projected outcome. Also, what gains were made were mostly made as a result of the massive slave labor system that the Soviet Union had now developed, centered around, as we mentioned before, these gulag systems where they were storing